Hannah Dunn 10, December 25th, 2039 AD. The congregation was growing, and many of them were there that Christmas day to join in the festivities, for Hannah celebrated Christmas. She made it well known that she was not Christian, nor did she pledge herself to any of the world's religions, and encouraged that members of her congregation celebrate the day with her not in honor of any religious figurehead or institution, but for the peace and love that are at the core of the holiday. Peace and love that she said the Spirit would one day embrace the world with. They had a gift-giving ceremony each year, whereupon everyone received a small trinket from Hannah, and many exchanged gifts between each other. Hannah quite explicitly told them not to give her anything, for fear that she would be inundated with gifts not only from her congregation, but from those around the world who shared in their belief of the Spirit and regularly watched from home. She said that, in lieu of giving her a gift should they so desire, to give the would-be present for her to someone else in the name of the Spirit, someone in need if they thought it right, and she told them that any gift that she should receive in person or through the mail would be re-gifted to a charity for redistribution. It didn't stop them from sending over 1,000 gifts to her every year, which made the good people at the charity she had chosen very happy, and every unopened gift was redirected to the charity with a little tag that read, "A gift from the Society of the Spirit," and underneath that, "May the Spirit protect you in your time of need," all handwritten by Hannah herself. The shit was getting deep, and she was in way over her head. There were many cheers, as there were always many cheers while she addressed her flock that evening, but there was one man there who was not cheering. A stranger had come through the door that Christmas day. He looked like an indiscriminate regular guy. Nobody suspected him of anything, and being as there were so many people there, nobody noticed when he suddenly disappeared from the crowd. "It's Christmas Day, a day for peace, love, and unity around the world." Her voice reverberated through the hall with its unnecessarily high ceilings as she addressed the crowd and cameras from her altar. There were long purple curtains behind her that draped from a black rod with gold rope tethered to the ties, ready to be drawn open and reveal another Christmas surprise. She went on. "It's another Christmas that I and so many of you owe to the Spirit who saved us. Another day that I would not be here had the Spirit not intervened on my behalf." She paused frequently for applause and waited until it was quiet enough to speak again before going on. "Christmas," she paused and took the microphone from the tripod and began to pace the altar with it in hand. "Christmas has been my favorite holiday since I was a child. I wasn't raised Christian, but we, like so many other non-Christian families, still celebrated Christmas because it's great fun. Giving and receiving gifts brings such joy to people, and I love the notion that the day is intended to embody the love of man for one another, but not all people are good to their brothers and sisters, even on this day." The congregation shushed each other, and the room grew much quieter. A mother with her fussy new baby in hand, a new and cherished bundle of joy to replace the one the Spirit had taken years ago, seated in the back, dismissed herself with her baby to the hallway as her precious child's noise level became overly apparent. She went on after the dramatic silence built the anticipation. "Even on this day, a day when we know that we are especially supposed to care for each other and love one another, still there are people out in the world that on this day will commit some atrocity and imperil one of their brothers or endanger one of their sisters, if not many of them." The silence continued and she proceeded. "This is why I am thankful every day for the Spirit. This is why every day I give thanks for the Spirit, because we need Him every day. Because every day someone somewhere is saved by the Spirit, and He is needed by so many so often. He cannot answer every call, and the murders and rapes and other crimes we still hear of every day are a testament to how much we need Him everywhere." The congregation cheered and quieted once more. Hannah, as gorgeous and captivating as ever, walked back and forth along the stage in front of the altar in her long white gown and continued. "He needs our help. He needs us to be kind to one another. He needs people that he needn't worry about committing murder or kidnapping a child or doing any of the other horrendous things some people do to one another. The congregation welled up again, not as boisterous as before. The sound began to hush, and she went on. That is where all of you come in, and she gestured at them with open palms. Someone in the congregation hooted from the back in agreement. Many of you have seen for yourself the awesomeness of the Spirit, she said, walking back to her place behind the narrow altar and placing the microphone back in its holder. For those of you that haven't, I wish for you to one day see him, only to let your life not be in danger when you do. Then she said one of the phrases that beckoned response from the crowd. She said, "Let the Spirit be with us." And the congregation in unison echoed her last words, "Spirit be with us," before going quiet again. "I think that's enough of a sermon for the day," she said. "Now, if you'll all reach under your pews and chairs, you'll find a little Christmas gift from me to you all." She gave them all a few seconds to open them, and when she started hearing the first cooing oohs and ahs from her flock, she explained. "It's just a trinket, a little reminder of the Spirit to carry with you in your travels. For those of you viewing this from home, it's a little marble-sized crystal to symbolize the crystal ball used by the Spirit. It's a symbol of His presence that you can carry in your pocket or purse, a reminder that He is always with you. I have another gift to share with you, friends. It's my very special new painting featuring depictions of many of you. I call it He Saves. Feel free to inspect it when you have the chance, should you so desire. Once I pull back these curtains, the festivities can begin. There are refreshments for all in the back. Spirit be with you." "And with you," they almost all said in unison. She intended to gradually descend the steps behind the altar, but ended up running down them hurriedly as a gunshot sounded, and part of the altar splintered off and went flying into the air. Someone was shooting at her. Some of the people in the congregation screamed, and Hannah darted down the steps and ran to hide behind the purple curtains. A voice was heard from the second floor of the meeting hall, where a newly broken window revealed the location of the shooter, and the would-be assassin yelled over the noise of the crowd, "Where's your spirit now?" He prepared to take the second shot, Hannah squarely in his sights behind the flowing drapes, but then suddenly his gun was crushed in his hands along with his hands. It was so dark in the room on the second floor that the shooter never even saw that Daniel had manifested in the air beside him, but he saw him now. Daniel then did something uncharacteristic for Daniel. He fully exposed himself. He flew out of the broken window, holding the screaming man by his crushed hands, and floated out over the congregation. The stationary cameras were all pointed at the stage, and the active cameramen had all fled from their stations when the shot went off. Because the rights to the footage of her congregations had been sold, Hannah would not allow anyone to bring recording devices, including cell phones, into the society hall, so no camera was filming him. After all, no one aims cameras at ceilings. Not even the security cameras got an image of him. As he floated out in the air, coming to rest 20 feet above the middle of the pews, a complete silence gripped the congregation, and the screams of the shooter were suddenly stifled when Daniel looked into his ball, lifted the kicking, screaming man up to look him in the eye, and smashed his head with his ball, which now had only tiny grooves of his knuckles indicating that his hand was not a ball itself. Just as one of the cameramen got their wits about them enough to run back to the camera and angle it up, Daniel threw the dead body across the room to land with a smack in front of Hannah's altar and disappeared. The cameraman managed to catch the tail end of the body being thrown through the air, but the spirit had disappeared by the time he managed to swing it around to where it had just been. The silence lingered as the mist of blood settled over the congregation. Some of them, especially those in the front row adjacent where the body had landed, had red faces, speckled with the fresh blood of the dead man. When Hannah suddenly heard the crowd well up and cheer, she came out from behind the drapes. She saw the body and saw that the crowd was on its feet, jumping up and down in celebration and cheering, and without her microphone on, she tried to question the patrons in the front row over the loud noise on her way up to the altar. "Was he here?" she asked as she returned to the stage. "Did you see him?" The few in the front pew that were trained on her and had heard her, some with hands clasped, some smearing the blood on their faces as they wiped tears from their eyes, nodded and affirmed that he had come. Hannah stepped up to the microphone and said, "Spirit be praised!" And the sheep bleated their unanimous response, "Spirit be praised!" It was later discovered that the would-be assassin's name was John Harrington, a devout Christian who thought that the best gift he could give to his Lord Jesus, peace-loving Jesus, for his birthday that year was the spilt blood of the heretical leader of what he perceived to be a growing cult, a pagan cult. Worshipping a ghost or spirit who they say performs miracles, who they say saves them, instead of worshipping the Holy Trinity who truly saves? Blasphemy. They utter only blasphemy, according to him. John Harrington wrote it all in his letter, and explained in it that the evening was intended to close with a murder-suicide, his named bullets intended for both the heretic Hannah Dunn and himself, in the name of God. His body was still warm as she stepped down and unveiled what was behind the curtains. It was her giant mural, "He Saves," and she thought that never would there ever have been a more appropriate time to reveal it to her congregation than on this night of his appearance. It featured the images of 75 survivors and was meant to symbolize how they see the spirit. She just wished that she could have seen him again, and concluded in the end that it was her fault that she had missed him. For if she had held true to her faith and faced her shooter without fear, trusting in the spirit to save her, she would not have been cowering behind the curtains during his revelation that night to the rest of the congregation. Things must truly happen for a reason, she thought. He must have intended not to reveal himself to me without me having complete faith in him, she thought. No more appropriate setting could have been asked for in which to reveal her masterpiece to the world, she reasoned, and it was one of the best Christmases she'd had in years. So they danced and cheered and ate and drank, some of them even refusing to clean the blood from their faces as it was evidence of his being. Hannah eventually called the police, who had quite the time with her, finally concluding that she was, as one detective put it, 110% off her rocker. The popularity of the Society of the Spirit took off like a rocket after that. Because of the lack of video evidence, the actual existence of the spirit still remained speculative in the minds of many around the world. But the video footage of the actual event, with all the people looking up at something allegedly floating in the air, the screaming, the crushing sound, the sudden descent of John Harrington's body to the altar, the rain of blood onto the crowd and the subsequent cheering, along with the eyewitness testimony of the hundreds of people who had been in the society hall at the time to witness the whole thing and claimed to have seen the spirit, that was enough to convince many skeptics around the world that this may be a viable phenomenon, and the world at large started to take more than a passing interest in the spirit once more. For the first time since the elevator incident nearly a decade ago, the world was really paying attention. The attention was wonderful, and Hannah used the spotlight to further spread her message to the world. She told of the Spirit's coming as though it were the very presence of God on earth, a physical manifestation of a divine being. Many people around the world started to embrace the Society of the Spirit, and she even allowed for the opening of a second meeting hall on the other side of the country, provided that she still led the congregation over video conference. Then, many other sites started popping up around the world, and she would fly around and make appearances at the different installations to perform her televised sermons. The society was different, and it appealed to a demographic not already subjugated by unfounded beliefs, the atheists and non-believers and skeptics of the world, and soon their numbers swelled to the point where it was getting serious. Really serious. Alexander 11, May 3rd, 45,801 BC. Tuwala was in real trouble, but none of its people understood the severity of the problem. Having repeatedly crippled their own population with war amid their societies throughout the ages due to conflicting rulers, the Tuwalans had become a warring people in their souls, even though for a time their collective warring spirit was suppressed. For a time there was peace and diplomacy. What had brought on this brief period of world peace on Tuwala was the same thing that would be at the heart of its subsequent fall, the advent of high technology. Because there appeared a second sun in the sky. The second sun pulsed and grew, and though its changes were not detectable on a day-to-day basis, long-term observation revealed that it was wavering in its diameter, like the beating of a heart as it contracts and releases. Even at the height of Tuwalan technology, a space program was never founded, and study of astronomy and cosmology were severely lacking in relation to the more grounded sciences like geology, biology, and chemistry. There weren't yet terms in any Tuwalan dialect to describe stellar cycles, sunspots, or coronal mass ejections. They didn't have a word in their collective vocabulary for the menace that had destroyed their fragile society, yet it was destroyed all the same. When massive statewide power outages began to happen frequently all over Tuwala, none of them knew what was happening at first. When they became more and more frequent, many of the Tuwalan rulers decided that it must be the work of saboteurs from neighboring states, and they became suspicious of one another. Borders between states began to close, and Tuwalans seeking refuge from states that were crippled by permanent loss of electricity found themselves turned away at threat of execution only to starve to death or more commonly to be killed and eaten by their fellow desperate Tuwalans. This was perhaps the darkest time in all of Tuwala's history. Eventually, it became apparent that electricity itself was defying them, for every time a circuit was established, it would overload within weeks, and they wound up burning through all of their generators and lost most of their electrical equipment worldwide before eventually giving up. If they had figured out what was happening, perhaps they could have built countermeasures into their technology. All one must do to avoid an overloaded circuit during contact with high-energy particle streams from a coronal mass ejection is to switch off the circuit. But they didn't know that it was the second sun that was their enemy and not one another, so the peace Tuwala had known for 1,000 years crumbled in a matter of a few decades due to their suspicion of one another. War again became commonplace until they had decimated Tuwala back to a primitive state, and the last generation of Tuwalans lived in a world lit by torches and candles once more. In his teachings, Alexander would explain what had happened to their world. He would tell of the normal solar cycles of stars and how their magnetic fields go through periods of calm and restlessness. He would teach about how during these periods of restlessness known as solar maximums, sunspots would appear on the surfaces of stars, dark patches where the magnetic field lines were twisted and contorted, polarizing the affected area and causing the atoms to repel and dissipate, effectively lowering the temperature of the star. He told of how sometimes these areas of highly entangled magnetic field lines would suddenly right themselves, and the collapse would release material caught in the entangled lines. Any high-energy particles, charged protons, plasma, and highly energetic electrons that were traveling along the field line when the tension was released would end up being hurled out into space along the gravitational field lines of the star's planetary system. Little ones occurred frequently and were known as solar flares. When a considerable amount of mass was ejected from the star, it was then categorized as a coronal mass ejection. Any planet unlucky enough to find itself in the path of one of these coronal mass ejections would not only suffer the potential loss of a minute amount of atmosphere, but would also be irradiated at its poles as the high-energy particles careen along the planet's own magnetic field lines. Any electrical circuit in operation in the vicinity of the particle stream would be overloaded and suffer damage to its circuitry, thus the frequent power outages experienced across Tuwala. He would explain that this same phenomenon is what caused the appearance of the strange bands of colorful light then seen in the sky all over Tuwala every day and night. He would tell of how the northern and southern lights were always visible at some point during the Tuwalan year due to regular emission of particles from its mother star, but that the fact that they were now visible everywhere served as an indication of impending doom. For the second sun was incessantly bombarding Tuwala with cosmic rays and stellar material from afar, and though they no longer relied on electricity, they were still in danger of losing their atmosphere. Every day the protective atmosphere around Tuwala, which shielded its creatures from radiation, lost more and more strength. Soon it would be no more, as relentless as the invisible bombardment was. The Tuwalans, who at their height boasted a population in the tens of billions, now numbered but a few 100,000, and the survivors found themselves in a world rocked by catastrophic weather events on a regular basis. To make matters worse, it seemed that geologic activity under the planet's surface was increasing as well, and volcanic eruptions and Tuwala quakes began to occur with more frequency, more often than they had in all of recorded history. They were a doomed people on a dying planet when Alexander came to their aid, saved thanks to one little Tuwalan girl. Cancer ran rampant through the population because of the scattering of their protective magnetic field, and the life expectancy of the unwary Tuwalans had gone from 110 to 40 years of age as the unrelenting particles twisted their cells into cancerous mutations. The little Tuwalan had already lost her mother, Lilame, and her brother, Chigwit, and her father, Bayagnat, was sick. She had insisted that he stay behind as she went to fish that day, but he was stubborn and said that he was still well enough to help get their supper. That was the one good thing about their population decline. At least they no longer feared being cannibalized by other Tuwalans. Food, at least, was plentiful. Still, the water was not a safe place to be. The oldest scourge of the Tuwalan people still lurked in the depths, and unlike the Tuwalan people, they had not lost their taste for Tuwalan flesh. The Patrups had not changed in millions of years, and with the Tuwalan people decimated, they began to flourish once more. Because of the danger they posed to Tuwalans, they had been hunted to near extinction by the early Tuwalans, but during the period of worldwide civility, they were spared from extinction by being declared an endangered species, and became protected under penalty of law. Now they outnumbered the native Tuwalans, who once again feared the water, for the fanged 10 to 15 foot long scaly crocodilian Patrup was not as considerate to the Tuwalans as they had been to them, and would not hesitate to kill and eat one if given the opportunity. The problem was that the mouse-like Tuwalans were quick and had fast reflexes, and would more often than not evade the lunge of the Patrup with ease. It was only the patient Patrup who would get their kill, only the one that waited for the right conditions to strike who would have its quarry. The water was still and clear that day, still and clear enough to see the stripes on the fish 10 feet down. Bayagnat was fat, but he had not been fat until recent years. Unbeknownst to either of them, his recent weight gain was the result of the tumors growing in his gut and how they had affected his cancer-riddled body. His fur was even changing color, and dark splotches had started to appear on his skin. His ears weren't drooping, but they weren't lively and pricked up the way they always used to be. His daughter, in her patchwork dress, her ears were big and expressive. She was a funny-looking Tuwalan with her bigger-than-normal ears, a big, wide mouth which made for huge smiles, and an overbite that made her look even more mouse-like than your average Tuwalan. She had white and light blue fur, very little on her face as it was with Tuwalan females, and she was short for her age. She was the thing that made Bayagnat most happy, and his only remaining family. The village they lived in was small, consisting of only a few thousand Tuwalans, but they held their own, drudging through their lives on their way to death, content in their full bellies, but burdened by the unknown sickness that ravaged them and stole mothers from sons and daughters from fathers. She was a very happy little girl, and she brought joy with her wherever she went with her overly animated movements that accompanied her seemingly endless will to talk about anything and everything with whoever would listen to her. She had enthusiasm for everything. She was just a delightful little person. She was maturing, but Bayagnat was still in denial about it, and he refused to let her go off and mate yet. After all, she had only budded 2 years prior, evident by the second color appearing in her fur, and she was still a child, of breeding age or not. He often scattered knowing glances around at the ravenous boys in the village who looked at her with whole new eyes now, but she most often didn't notice, oblivious to such things in lieu of the wonders of everything else. Her favorite question started with the Tuwalan word for why, and she questioned everything. She wanted to know everything, but it seemed Tuwala had little to offer to satiate her curiosity beyond an archaic means. For much of the knowledge of the old world had been lost, and even though she desperately wanted him to, her father didn't know everything. He did know enough not to fish in the rain. He knew it was unwise to tempt fate, despite how unlikely an encounter could be. He knew better than to wait until the last minute, too, but he did anyway. When the rain started to fall, he announced that fishing was done and began to gather up their catch and their supplies. He knew that they should have been gone at the first sign of rain and not have waited until it began falling to retreat, But like so many who knew better before him, the lack of recent Patrup sightings in the vicinity made him lower his guard. The rain makes it difficult to see into the water, and it is one of the times most likely to be ambushed by a stalking Patrup. And the patient Patrups that had been watching them fish, lying motionless on the bottom of the lake just 20 feet away from them, stirred as soon as the rain started, and slowly inched up toward the unwary Tuwalan father and daughter. The little girl was laughing and dancing in the rain, welcoming the refreshing cool water on her body, and Bagnat watched her with a smile as he picked up the last of what he was going to carry. Then he told his daughter in their Tuwalan language to come and help carry one of the buckets. The laughing, loving girl did a cartwheel on her way, a cartwheel that didn't end with her smiling and laughing. Before her feet hit the ground, a pair of Patrups erupted from the water, one of the biggest she'd ever seen and a smaller one, presumably a mother and her offspring. The big one had bitten her father along his chubby torso, wrenching him from the ground, sending their dinner back into the lake, and their fishing equipment flying in every direction. He screamed, but not for long. Soon he was face down and partly under the water, and as the big one made the kill, but did not start eating, it nudged the smaller one and nodded its huge skull in the little girl's direction. The smaller Patrups are faster than the big ones, but they are still terrible climbers, and no match for the speed of a wary Tuwalan. As efficient a killer as the Patrup was, it was still limited in its range by its rigid spine. The little Tuwalan in the patchwork dress knew what she had to do, and she jumped up onto the cliff wall overlooking the water and clung to the rock face. Patrups couldn't go up, every Tuwalan knew that. The smaller Patrup was still pursuing her, not dumb enough to try and scale the rock wall, but smart enough to know that the little Tuwalan had to come down at some point. She looked up. She could see a ledge about 10 feet above her, and though the increasing rainfall made the cliff face more slippery than usual, it was still little challenge for her to climb up toward the ledge. Then the situation went from bad to worse as one of the second most feared enemy of the Tuwalans, a snarling Tenethit cat, appeared and leered at her from the ledge. The Tenethit cat had been watching them fish as well. It was just bad luck that the Patrups had struck first, alarming its prospective prey. When the little girl caught sight of the great, sleek, black cat awaiting her on the ledge above, she stopped climbing. She looked down and saw the larger Patrup tear one of her father's arms from his body and swallow it whole, and she started to cry hysterically. She was facing certain death. In her desperation, she invoked the name of the god of the ancient Tuwalans, a god she did not believe in. She pressed her palm against the rock face, closed her eyes, and asked for help from Tahoa. In her native tongue, she said, "Tahoa, please help me." A stillness, a quietness seemed to overtake the air. Then a thundering crack sounded as the mountainside above her shed its outer layer, and the entire side of the mountain came careening down around her, crashing into the lake below. The Tenethit cat ended up in the water and swam to safety on the shore, limping away, and the Patrups scattered and retreated to deeper waters. After what seemed like several minutes, as the last of the falling rocks splashed into the water, the little Tuwalan girl heard footsteps approaching from above. Then the rain started to intensify as she started to slowly and warily climb up toward the ledge, curiosity overtaking her sense of caution. While still clinging to the wet rock, a few feet below the protruding ledge, she saw a strange figure appear above, and she gasped, and then held her breath, pressing her body close to the mountainside as though she were trying to hide. It stood on the edge, looking down at her. He was huge, at least 10 feet tall, with broad shoulders, no fur, and very small ears. His skin was the gray of the mountain, and he looked like he was more polished stone than flesh and blood, with flat edges accentuating his joints in places where curved structures might have otherwise been. His form was intimidating, to be sure, but he did have a friendly face. She returned his gaze, unsure whether she ought to be afraid or not. "Are you all right, child?" the giant asked, in the dialect of Tuwalan familiar to the little girl. "Yes," she said, still unsure and hanging from the rocks. Good, thank you." "Take my hand." He bent down and extended his hand toward her. He had 5 fingers on his hand. How strange this was. Most creatures on Tuwala had 4 digits on their hands and feet, including the Tuwalan people. She decided after seeing its hand to trust the strange being and allowed him to help her up. Then she saw the devastated side of the still settling mountain and said, "Whoa." She looked back down. The ground where her father's corpse had been was buried under the rock that had fallen from the mountainside. Then she looked back at her mysterious savior and said, "My father, he's dead." "I know," the giant said. "I am sorry." The rain started falling even harder, and she shielded her eyes and said, "I sure wish it would stop raining," having to raise her voice over the sound of the sudden increase in rainfall. "Oh?" the giant said, and then he looked up and the clouds parted and sunshine came bursting in, followed by a distant booming sound. The little girl ducked down, startled by the sudden change to the sky, and then stood and laughed, the tears of her mourning drying in the light of such a miracle. "Are you Tahoa?" she asked, wiping her eyes. He didn't fit the physical description of the old world god whatsoever, but she could think of no other explanation that made any sense. "No," he said again in Tuvalan, "I am not Tahoa." "Oh," the little girl said in the same dialect, "then what is your name?" "I don't know," the giant said. "I don't think that I have one." The girl smiled and managed to laugh, something she didn't think she'd be doing again that day, and then she said, "Well, that won't do. Everyone needs a name." The giant thought for a moment and said, "Well, then perhaps you can give me a name." She put her hands on her hips and thought about it, then said, "You are big like the mountain, and you come from the mountain, so I shall call you Mountain. Do you like it?" The giant repeated the Tuvalan word for mountain, and then said, "Yes, I do like it. What is your name?" And the little Tuvalan twirled and bowed, and said in her happy voice, "My name is Lyelin." "Hello, Lyelin," the giant said. Then Lyelin addressed him by his new name, the Tuvalan word for mountain, which phonetically translated into English sounded like the words Hem and Hut put together. "Hello, Hem Hut," Lyelin said, and she clapped her hands in excitement, thrilled by having made such an amazing new friend. She took him to her village, skipping circles around him, chatting his ear off the whole time, asking him a zillion questions which almost always got the same response from him, a truthful and flat, "I don't know." "Where did you come from? Why are you here? How did you make the rain stop?" she asked, and so on, and always his answer was, "I don't know." When they approached the village, she excitedly called out to the villagers and knocked on walls throughout as she and the giant proceeded toward the village center. She announced him as Hemhut, Wonder of Tuwala, and she spoke of how he'd brought down a mountain and stopped the rain, and as villagers began to approach him with outstretched hands, he put his arms out to his sides in a welcoming gesture and smiled in what little way he could manage. He had found a home at last, and he was truly not alone because he had a friend. He had Lyelin. And so Alexander would from then on be known by his favorite name, the name given to him by the little Tuvalan destined to steal his heart. And every Tuvalan from then on until the end of time would know the tale of Hemhut, the savior of the people of Tuwala, and Lyelin, the little orphan Tuvalan girl who drew him from the mountainside to save her and then won his favor. It was a love story for the ages, the tale of Hemhut and Lyelin.